Throughout its existence, humanity has always waged wars. However, every war eventually ends. The only question is, how does it end? Today we will talk about how a war was ended not by a decisive victory of one side, but by the pressure of public opinion, thanks to television. You will learn how media coverage of conflicts can influence public opinion and ultimately lead to the making of foreign policy decisions by entire nations. What were the initial causes of the war before the arrival of American troops in Vietnam? It all begins with France's colonial legacy and Vietnam's struggle for independence. Vietnam had been a French colony from the mid-19th century until the beginning of World War II. During the war, Japan occupied Vietnam, but after its end, French colonial authorities attempted to regain control. This led to the First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954, in which Vietnamese communists led by Ho Chi Minh fought not against Japanese occupation but against French colonial forces. The Geneva Accords of 1954 ended French colonial rule, dividing Vietnam into the Communist North, Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and the anti-communist South, Republic of Vietnam. It was planned that general elections would be held within 2 years to unify the country, but this did not happen. A political and ideological struggle began within the country. South Vietnam, supported by the USA and other Western countries, opposed communist unification, while North Vietnam sought to unify the country under communist rule. This led to an internal conflict between pro-American and pro-communist forces. In 1954, the United States assumed financial and military support for South Vietnam, which eventually led to the growth of nationalist and communist movements in the region. Within South Vietnam, the Viet Cong, a communist guerrilla army supported by North Vietnam, became active. Their goal was to overthrow the South Vietnamese government and unify the country. The involvement of the United States in the Vietnam conflict increased significantly before direct participation in combat under President John F. Kennedy, growing from just under 1,000 military advisors in 1959 to 23,000 in 1964. This decision was prompted by North Vietnam's invasion of Laos in 1958 to support local insurgents, establishing the Ho Chi Minh Trail for supplying and strengthening the Viet Cong. Using this route, North Vietnamese sent 40,000 soldiers in 1963 to fight against South Vietnam. However, the U.S. could not help its ally, South Vietnam, win solely with money and advisors, so direct intervention was necessary. But how could this be done without facing international criticism for an unjustified invasion of another country? The answer was very simple: the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is the general name for 2 episodes that occurred in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin in August 1964 involving the naval forces of the USA and North Vietnam. As a result of the second incident, when North Vietnamese boats allegedly attacked the American destroyer USS Maddox in international waters, the U.S. Congress passed the so-called Tonkin Resolution, providing President Lyndon Johnson with legal grounds to directly use the country's armed forces in the Vietnam War. Television began to rapidly develop in the mid-20th century. By the 1950s, it became accessible to a wide audience and quickly gained popularity. By the 1960s, television was already the primary source of information for millions of people worldwide. Before television, the main sources of news were newspapers and radio. However, television offered something new: the opportunity to see events with one's own eyes. Television reports allowed viewers to watch events in almost real time, making the news more vivid and convincing. When the Vietnam War began, television became the main channel through which Americans learned about the events. Every evening, news broadcasts showed footage from the front, making the war more real and closer to the people. Initially, most Americans supported their country's participation in the war, considering it necessary to fight communism. However, when real footage of combat, destruction, and human suffering began to appear on television screens, public opinion began to change. Brutal scenes and eyewitness accounts raised more and more questions about the meaning and necessity of the war.
A battalion of U.S. 1st Air Cavalry clashes with North Vietnamese regulars in the central coastal plain near Bong Son. Heavy and accurate sniper fire, zeroed in by telescopic sights, keeps our forces pinned down and dug in. Supporting fire from airmobile gunships helps to drive off the Kong, estimated to number about 150. After the fighting, copters put down to evacuate the wounded. 2 Americans were listed as dead. One was a machine gunner, and the second his company commander, who took over the machine gun from his fallen comrade and was killed himself. 13 GIs were wounded, 4 enemy soldiers were counted among the casualties.
The war had already lasted for quite a long time, and journalists, along with ordinary American viewers, had seen many things, from urban battles and the execution of Vietnamese prisoners and civilians to the total destruction of jungles with the help of Agent Orange. In 1968, American journalist Walter Cronkite, already known throughout the country, went to Vietnam and made several reports. It was an extensive and unique chronicle of military events. He went to the Vietnam War as a supporter but returned as a convinced opponent. Upon returning, Cronkite expressed his opinion on the air in the form of a reasoned criticism of the Vietnam campaign. Cronkite's speeches were so trusted and authoritative among Americans that President Lyndon Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Some Americans even believed that it was Walter Cronkite who stopped the war by personally visiting Vietnam and expressing his personal opinion on the air. "The Vietnam campaign has come to a stalemate," said Cronkite, and soon the troops were withdrawn from the country. Of course, in reality, he was just one of the key supporters of the anti-war campaign within the USA, which was gaining momentum and attracting more attention from both the general public and well-known personalities. Meet, this is Muhammad Ali. He became the U.S. Army's top draft dodger when the boxer refused to participate in combat, explaining his decision with religious beliefs. War is contrary to the teachings of the Quran. We should not take part in any war except the one declared by Allah, the athlete said, adding, in addition, the racial issue. Why should I travel 10,000 miles from home and rain bullets and bombs on the Vietnamese while in my hometown of Louisville, so-called blacks are treated like dogs and denied basic human rights? On April 28, 1967, Muhammad Ali was arrested for refusing to serve in the army, threatened with 5 years in prison and a $10,000 penalty. On the same day, the New York State Athletic Commission revoked his boxing license and took away his world title. On June 20th, the court found Ali guilty. But the athlete did not flee the country, even on the contrary. Despite the total supervision of the FBI, he actively participated in the growing anti-war protests and also spoke on college campuses with calls for racial equality. In 1971, the court decided to overturn the athlete's conviction, not because of his star status, but because the previous verdict was unreasonable. Ali subsequently regained his boxing license and became a key figure in the anti-war movement in the United States. After returning home, Many Vietnam War veterans faced psychological and physical trauma as well as a lack of support from the government and society. Society in general condemned the war veterans, saying that they did not send them there. Naturally, this led to growing resentment and further protests from the ex-military, who were now unable to arrange their personal lives in peaceful conditions. Many veterans suffered from alcoholism or drug addiction, and their social image became more and more unhealthy. In 1967, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War organization was founded and became one of the most influential anti-war groups. This movement brought together veterans who were dissatisfied with the war and wanted justice for those who had suffered as a result of the conflict. One of the most famous events was a demonstration on the steps of the Capitol, when veterans threw their medals and patches over the fence, symbolizing their rejection of the war and their role in it. Influenced by public opinion and anti-war protests, many politicians began to publicly express their doubts and criticism of the Vietnam War. Senator Robert Kennedy, brother of President John F. Kennedy, became one of the first major politicians to speak out against the war. In a speech to the Senate in 1967, he stated, "Every day of the Vietnam War undermines our moral and political leadership in the world." The senator spoke openly about the need to review U.S. policy in Vietnam, pointing to growing frustration among Americans. President Lyndon Johnson, who initially supported the escalation of the war, announced his decision in 1968 not to run for a second term. In a speech, he acknowledged, "The division in our country caused by the war is too great." President Richard Nixon, who came to power with the promise of an honorable peace in Vietnam, also felt the influence of public opinion. In a speech in 1969, he said, "The American people have made clear their willingness to see an end to this war." The words and actions of politicians showed how important the voice of the people is in a democratic society. Their decisions were a direct result of public pressure and anti-war protests. In 1969, President Richard Nixon announced the Vietnamization strategy, which aimed to transfer responsibility for the conduct of the war to the armed forces of South Vietnam. This involved the gradual withdrawal of American troops from Vietnam. Television played an important role in covering this process, showing both the return home of American soldiers and the ongoing fighting, which fueled public interest in the end of the war. In January 1973, the Paris Agreement was signed, which provided for a ceasefire and the withdrawal of U.S. troops. Television footage of the signing ceremony and the return of prisoners of war became a symbol of the long-awaited peace. Thus, the phase of direct U.S. involvement in the conflict ended, and in 1975 North Vietnam completely absorbed the former U.S. ally, South Vietnam. The war forced the U.S. to revise its foreign policy and its role in international conflicts. The doctrine of containment of communism, with which the Americans invaded Vietnam, lost its relevance. The so-called Vietnam Syndrome, a public and political reluctance to get involved in foreign conflicts so as not to repeat the sad experience of the Vietnam War, has taken shape. American foreign policy will suffer from it for many years to come, until it appears. But we'll talk about that in another video. And you, as you study history with us, don't forget, the further you look back, the further you see forward.